Okay, thank you, Luciano and Alex, for inviting me. I hope not to disappoint you. In fact, but I have to start with disclaimers, so we're setting off with the wrong foot. No, the first disclaimer is really that I'm not an election specialist. So I normally study the processes that come before and after elections. So processes of interest formation, particularly at the subnational level, and governance processes. Then in a bout of optimism, I had promised to Luciano that I could perhaps say something about the influence of subnational level on national elections, to show how the crisis in particular affects center-periphery relations, political relations, but in particular voting, sorry for the typos, and government formation. So that was a very ambitious kind of agenda, which of course, I couldn't fulfill. So for two good reasons. First of all, there are a plethora of different center-periphery relations in Europe, so it's very difficult to generalize. It's certainly more the agenda for a whole team of scholars, not just one person. And probably still the most dynamic and relevant multi-level dynamic is that between member states and the Union. So I changed my question, and I am submitting the following sort of argument. First of all, the question is, how do the coexistence and the interaction between two parliamentary levels affect representation at each level? And then I'm going to develop a thesis by using mostly, if you want, political theory tools. So it's fairly theoretical, and there's not much. There is some background research that I've done, but on a different topic. So I'm just sort of extrapolating. So I'm very sorry if this is too abstract and theoretical. So first of all, I start from an observation that elections in the EU multi-level political system are losing, in my opinion, much of their traditional functions. And perhaps they are acquiring new ones. I don't want to shock an audience of specialists on elections, but I tend to think that elections are really sort of changing a little bit their function and skin, and perhaps there is even a little bit of over-evaluation of the significance of elections in complex processes like those that go on at the European Union. So to begin by quoting people who do know about elections, first of all, the European Union is revealing how representative democracy and not necessarily representative government is what goes on at EU level. And within the representative function, so within just representative democracy, I want to show that two very important functions. On the one hand, formation of judgment and formation and expression of will, and I will elaborate on these two, occur at different levels and in slightly different manners, in the sense that there is a division of labor between the two levels, and no level fulfills fully all of the functions that we expect from parliamentary assemblies. And that creates a number of problems, both particularly for voters that have a difficulty understanding what exactly they're voting for. So I will try to argue that formation of judgment happens particularly at EU level, and partially also at national level, and expression of will mostly at EU level. And the final piece of my thesis is that the crisis is making this peculiar division of labor finally much more clear to EU citizens. So in many ways, they are coming to grips with the particularities of the EU system. Quickly, parliamentary functions. I am using a terminology that I draw mostly from Nadia Urbinati's work, but also from other political theorists like Michael Sayward and others that have reworked the notion of representation. Parliaments in representative parliamentary democracies give voice to the people, mostly. I'm simplifying, there are other functions, but the most important ones are giving voice to the people, forging the popular will, and control the executive. Now, Urbinati in her work combines voice and will, which she calls judgment, and control is what she calls surveillance. I don't know if it's important to use one or the other term, but just to tell you, how you could find it in Urbinati's work. Otherwise said, judgment is distinguished between an active doing, that is a proposing, activating, which is mostly the voice side of representation, and a passive also doing, which consists of receiving and surveilling. And this is and I don't know if surveilling actually exists as a verb, but it's surveillance. Why focus so much attention on representation and really on the activity of representation more than on government? Well, for Urbinati, representative democracy is not like how can I say, a convenient replacement of direct democracy, but it's a form of democracy in and of itself, and in fact it's a superior form of democracy, and cannot be limited just simply to electoral democracy, so it's not exhausted by the act of voting. Here I have a quote from Urbinati, and what I want us to stress is that it's a complex political process that activates the sovereign people, so it has also a constitutive element. It creates the subject of representation. And the other important item is that fluctuating units of civil society are unified and connected, and through this act of representation, and there is also this projecting activity of citizens into future-oriented perspective. So basically, through democratic representation, the subject, that is the constituency, is created. It doesn't exist necessarily beforehand. Disparate individuals, which are normally differentiated by their own particular biographies, as she says, discover their commonalities and become a collective subject. So the sovereign subject is created through representation. Again, just to give you a sense for where I draw these ideas, Urbinatis is known for her notion of representation as advocacy, which is a process through which what is common, as I said, among the individuals becomes apparent and gets ordered, etc. Which, again, as I said, is not so distant from Michael Sayward's notion of representation as claim making, which also entails this dialogue between the claim maker and the audience. So it is the ongoing dialogue that matters. And this does not take place only in representative assemblies, even though they are very important forums for that, but also in other institutional, that is, governance settings, and even, I would say, in everyday societal activities, so through participation and even through mobilization. Another quote, for people like quotes, but I think some of these things are really quite inspiring. Just I underline just one passage which is useful for me to contest the different notion of the subject. Representation can never be truly descriptive and mimetic of social segmentation and identities because of its unavoidable inclination to transcend the here and now and project instead a would-be or ought-to-be perspective. Okay, I used the term coined by Ben Crum and Jon-Erik Fossum, the EU multi-level parliamentary field, loosely, just to understand one another. But very quickly, we all know EU citizens enjoy two types of electoral representation, direct and indirect. National parliaments, and here I start to use the vocabulary that I just introduced, serve a double function. They certainly contribute to the formation of political will at EU level through authorization, the authorization that they grant to governmental representatives to decide in the proper European institutions, And they also act as a control mechanism on EU legislation, particularly now through the early warning mechanism. Now, the European Parliament also serves a double function, directly contributes to legislation, and also exerts a certain kind of control, a certain degree of control, which it fought very hard to acquire and increase, on a number of agencies and committees. So basically, national parliaments are mostly about what Urbinati calls judgment, whereas the European Parliament is about judgment and will formation. So this is, the allocation of these different functions and tasks is not so crystal clear to EU citizens, probably, so they may still be confused as to which representative function can be performed by national and European Parliament. So campaigns and elections are likely to be a little bit sort of also I don't know, about the wrong kind of activities. At the national level, they are still about very much, we discuss about policies, which would fall under the formation of will, which in fact national parliaments can affect only marginally, and some parliaments do that better than others insofar as they instruct and keep their governments on a tight leash. The governmental representatives who then decide in Brussels. And national elections are unfortunately less about the surveillance function of national parliaments, which is as I said, the passive part of judgment, which is control on governmental representatives in council and through the subsidiarity clause. Now, campaigns and elections at EU level instead are still mostly about the scope and reach of the Union, so about the constitutional balance of power in the Union, which the European Parliament cannot really affect, if not by a very sort of remote byproduct of certain decisions in certain policy areas, for example, the tug-of-war on budget and other areas. So this disconnect between what has been debated before elections at the two levels it causes confusion, and I think also it's bound to cause disaffection at both levels. Unless political discourse openly acknowledges this sort of new division of labor between the two levels, and unless the debates and the campaigns are structured around this kind of discourse, I don't think that the situation will really improve. So a note on the formation of the sovereign people through this kind of democratic representation. I really disagree with those who think that the formation of a EU demos can take place through mathematical aggregation of the various demoi. This idea of securing strict proportionality to the peoples of Europe, I think, is going really in the wrong direction. It is pointing at the very least to a very partial and a very special and peculiar notion of demos. Rather, I think that the formation of a EU demos could take place only to the extent to which there is a clear dialogue on the issues and the functions between candidates and voters, and an ongoing dialogue also between representatives once they are elected into the various parliaments. So the risk of not engaging these discourses at the right level for the right functions is not only the failed formation of the EU demos, but I would argue also the deformation or the deconstruction of the national demoi. So ultimately, representative democracy, that is, political theory summarized through this triad of political equality, public control, and right to justification, is not exhausted by the expression of will, and I think we're also pretty much obsessed with, with identifying the matching chains of delegation and accountability, running, of course, in opposite direction, as the ultimate indication of democracy. I think that this is, in fact, a fairly distorted view of democracy, or partial view of democracy. And representation is as much as about expressing a voice and exerting surveillance as it is about exerting will. And as I said, these three functions are not the sole functions of parliaments. And I conclude by going back to the original ambition, which was to draw some connections and some inspiration also from the subnational level, which is the level that I studied most. And of course, I just propose a number of fairly obvious statements. Subnational level affects national politics in different ways, depending on the form of state, in federal, regionalized state more than in unitary states. However, the crisis is causing big problems to subnational governments. For example, the Stability Pact affects very much local finances, often without even the regional, not to mention the municipal level, being ever consulted in how to really, where to take the money and how to redistribute funds. The crisis, moreover, has imposed differential costs to different regions and localities, and so is affecting the whole single market project and also the economic, social, and territorial cohesion, which are principles enshrined in the treaties. The interesting thing is the Committee of the Region, another, if you want, representative assembly that nobody talks about because it's not very powerful in terms of expressing will. It does not have any formal decision-making power, but I find it very interesting, has issued a number of opinions complaining about the fact that the subnational level has been sidelined, that cohesion policy is in danger, and that they also tried to support the Commission proposal for a financial transaction tax, which, however, was never adopted in a plenary, and to my knowledge, has not been implemented. So why look at a representative assembly like the Committee of the Regions, which is really, not even a formal EU institution, it's really a minor body, consultative body? Well, precisely because it is a purely consultative committee and therefore is deprived of the function of expressing will, it can concentrate itself on the formation and expression of voice, and to some extent also through its contribution to subsidiarity control on surveillance. And I think, and by studying the Committee of the Regions, I had noticed how that these representatives that have their mandate in regions and provinces and municipalities in Europe have been able to upgrade the interests they represent and to transcend by, borrowing again Urbinati's word, the here and now, and to project instead a would-be or ought-to-be perspective, and so much so that they claim that they are the voice of the periphery, or as they say, the voice from the grounds up. And I think we could learn something also from this minor representative assembly. That's it. Thank you.